Welcome to the first of four lecture series in the course entitled The Doctrine of Man and Sin. In this course, basically what we're going to look at is the necessity for understanding who you are, the biblical idea concerning that. We're going to be looking at a lot of Hebrew and going and looking at basically how all of this kind of fits together. In the course of this, of course, I hope you do the readings that are there and that all of this will eventually begin to make some sense as we go through it. If you have any questions, of course, you can use my email at any time and contact me, and I'll be glad to get back with you concerning any questions that you might have or concerns that you might have concerning the text. And, of course, I'd like feedback on how the course is going, whether it's helping you, and therefore we'll make progress with it in that way. So let's start today with the first lecture, basically in what is man. If you will, get your Bible and go to Matthew 22. We're going to base this off of something that Jesus says, beginning with verse 34. That's Matthew 22, beginning with verse 34, and I'll be reading from the American Standard Version. When the Pharisees heard that he had put the Sadducees to silence, they gathered themselves together. And one of them, a lawyer, asked him a question, trying him. Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law? And he said unto him, Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, and with all thy soul, and with all thy mind. This is the greatest and first commandment. And the second like unto it is this, Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. And these two commandments, on these two commandments, the whole law hangeth, and the prophets. In other words, the concept of loving God and loving your neighbor kind of fell into place. But a lot of times we forget another part of that verse. So that's what we're going to look at today. Now, of all the questions that man has asked of himself, I don't think there's any that are more important than this one. And that is, who am I? What is man? And there's a lot of discussion today on humanistic grounds that he's a cosmic accident and a naked ape and, that type of thing. And that all this plays into the idea of that we're basically our own gods and we determine our own self-worth. But with serious intent, I really want to seek an answer that transcends all what I would consider to be mundane and simple answers that usually are given. To say, well, we're, created in the image of God. But exactly what does that mean? And what's the purpose of it? And what's my purpose today? I don't deny the fact that I'm created in the image of God. It's just why? What was the reason for it? Because you see, with your answer to those questions, you set for yourself and those closest to you the path that you're going to seek in life and the path that goes into eternity. So the ultimate question that we're going to be spending the next few weeks on is basically, what is man? And then more intimately, who are you? Now, some years ago, I taught English and American literature. And in American literature, one of the authors was a man by the name of Jack London. And Jack London was known for his works like Call of the Wild and White Fang. And in those, a lot of the times, he would take the point of view of the animal and would deal with how the animal was thinking and how the animal would react to certain things and why the animal would react in that way. And it was quite a unique piece of writing. However, he also wrote short stories. And one of his short stories, called A Piece of Steak, he talks about an aged fighter in Australia that has 2 kids, a loving wife, but he has no food, and he has no rent money, and he has no credit, and his body is broken from years of fighting. Once he was a champion boxer. He was on top of his game. He was young, and he made a lot of money. And he would give steaks to a dog that he had and thought nothing of it. When people asked him for money, he gave it to them. There was always plenty more, coming to him. But now his age has caught up with him. He's beginning to see some limitations that he has. He's offered to come in the rink as the aged, old, famous fighter of past year and take on the new upcomer who's hungry for quick money and fame that success is going to bring him. And he's told, you'll get the purse if you win, but you're going to get nothing if you lose. As he thinks about this fight, he remembers years ago when he was an up-and-comer, how he fought the old champion and beat him, and how that after the fight, the man sat in the locker room and cried. And he couldn't figure out why. But now, things can be different. Now he can get the money for the rent. Now he can get the money, for his children, and it all takes one fight. Unfortunately, he loses. He knocked the young fighter down 3 times. But in Australian rules, that's not enough for a down and out. So he gets back up, and because he hasn't had anything substantial to eat, no steak, no anything, his stamina gives out. And he's eventually knocked out. So at the end of the story, he finds himself penniless, sitting on a park bench and crying. Like the old fighter that he had fought years ago, and now he understands why the man was crying. The future looks absolutely hopeless. There has to be a way for human beings to continue living and fighting and growing without giving up. But how many people have you known that gave up to the struggles of life and just quit fighting because they didn't know who they were? They didn't know what they were. Paul Simon wrote a song called The Boxer that goes like this. In the clearing stands a boxer and a fighter by his trade, and he carries the reminder of every glove that laid him down or cut him, till he cried out in his anger and his shame, I'm leaving. But the fighter still remains. Yes, a boxer can leave aside his glove, he can leave the ring, but he can never escape being a fighter so long as he's going to be a man, because that's his identity. See, that's who he believes he is. And without that identity, what is he? And the answer that most people will give will be nothing. You see, to be a man or a woman in this world means you have to struggle. You have to fight for what you get. You can't struggle without being a fighter, and we certainly understand that. And to be a good fighter, you have to have the will and the heart and the intensity of a fighter. Okay. And if one has that intensity, he can go on with the struggle of life no matter what the battle is, or how many defeats he struggles with, or how many things that go wrong in his life. If you don't lose heart, you can stay in the realm of human life. But for what purpose? Why? Why would anybody want to do that? Paul's a fighter. He hung in there. And the reason for his success was he had such a great thing to fight for. It wasn't for him. It was for something much greater than him. He went all over the world struggling, not for him, but for other people. Do you ever wonder how did he do it? He suffered shipwreck. He was beaten. He was cut up. He was stoned. He was jailed. How did he keep getting up? And when he did get back up, why did he go right back into the fray, right back into the fight, and continue with the struggle? Wasn't it time to just stop? It reminds me of a little crayfish that got out of a creek bed where he belonged and got stuck on top of a train rail. As the train got closer and closer and it begins to rumble and rumble and rumble, the little crayfish's eyes get wider and wider, and the last thing he was seen to do was to reach up and pinch at the mighty iron horse. That's not Paul. Paul did keep snapping away, though his body was under such abuse. While that train crushed the crayfish, it doesn't seem like he was ever crushed. How did his spirit stay alive? Well, Jesus answered that. Once a lawyer came to him and asked, how do you inherit eternal life? And Jesus said, well, it can be phrased, how do you not give up? How do you keep going? How do you win as a human being? And the answer, you love your neighbor as you love yourself. How are you doing in that department? Do you love yourself? And I'm not talking about some big, huge ego trip, where you expect the world to bow down to you and they're there for every whim that you have. I'm talking about just good old self-esteem. Let me ask you another question. Are you getting too much love? Most would simply answer, no, I'm not getting too much. Are you getting enough? That's the question we need to deal with this morning. Let's start off with the way that many people feel about themselves, and then we'll progress from there. I think most people don't like themselves because I don't think they know how to love me. I think they say, if you ever knew me, you wouldn't really love me. And how can a person come to love himself when our society measures our worth by two things, looks and performance? I mean, let's take the Miss America contest. Okay, that pretty much gathers the looks and performance up. But how many Miss Americas can there be? In any athletic contest, there's only one winner. In any debate contest, there's only one winner. In any King of the Hill battle, there's only one winner. Not two, one. And if that's the measurement of human worth, we're in a lot of trouble. And when you get up in the morning, one of the first things that you do is you go and look at yourself in the mirror. Do you like what you see? You see the acne? See the fat? You see the thin? You see the wrinkles, the age spots, the receding hairline? I don't know, maybe all you see is a nose. Our society really does have a nose problem, you know that? No one wants a big nose, except maybe Jimmy Durante. Do you know what you do with a big nose? You love it. The more that there is of it, the more you have to love. That's because you understand your identity. You're not measuring yourself the way that other people are. You're not measuring yourself by standards that aren't in the Bible. You see, that's what we do with imperfections on faces and bodies. We learn to love who we are, and we learn to love what we've been given because we understand our purpose. You know, we really need to look at ourselves in the mirror with all blemishes and imperfections and simply say, you know what, I love you. And a lot of people find that very difficult because many Christians believe they're supposed to hate themselves. Why? Because they're sinful creatures. And the grace of God may be there, but we don't really believe it. And so we continually beat ourselves up. In the Middle Ages, monks would sit and would thrash themselves on their back and cut themselves because of their desperate, sinful nature. They think that loving themselves is wrong. It indicates too much pride. And nothing is further from the truth. You see, it's impossible to love others if you loathe yourself. Because you're supposed to love others the way that you love yourself. So Isaac Galton, in 1883, decided he would do research on what made a face beautiful and what made a face ugly. His research finally concluded, he said, a beautiful face has regular features, an ugly face has a few surprises. And since we all love surprises, we can look in the mirror and go, surprise, and walk away contented. Because we're made in the image of God. And men, well, we usually worry about two things, height and hair. You ever noticed how that when a man begins to lose his hair, how creative he gets with his comb-overs? And then you begin to hear phrases like, God only made a few perfect heads, the rest he covered with hair. So you see toupees and various hairstyles begin to take place, and you have plugs, and you have all these agencies that say they can help you with your hair. And men begin to panic when they see their hair coming out in the sink. And at that point, they have to decide, what's this going to do to me? Am I going to hate myself if I lose my hair? Unfortunately, this is man's problem, I believe. We don't know who or what we are beyond the external. And it's for this reason that we pay so much attention to the external with creams and lotions and bath oils and all types of makeup and all that. Now, I'm not saying that we shouldn't try to look nice. That's not the point. I think the point is that so many people spend so much time on the external that they completely neglect looking deeper to see who they really are, to see something that makeup and toupees and comb-overs and nice clothes can't cover up. And then performance. Does performance really define who I am? I mean, seriously? Here's a person who earns $1 million a year. and another that earns $15,000 a year. Is one person worth more than the other because he earns more money? Or in other words, does the price in the job market determine your worth? If so, what do you do with those that are mentally disabled? What do you do with those who are aged? What do you do with those who are sick? I mean, are these people worth less because of their inability to work and think as productive as maybe other people? You see, because if I misunderstand where human worth comes from, I'm going to mistreat a lot of people. And there was one individual that didn't understand anything about human worth, and his name was Adolf Hitler. He said that the ultimate destiny of those who aren't able to contribute to the perfect society is extermination. He did not understand the worth of an individual. He did not understand why he was created, much less why anybody else. And the reason that we don't know our worth is that we don't know who we are. It's a desperate thing to really understand the concept, because that kind of misunderstanding brings us into bondage and not into the liberty that Jesus offers us. Jesus would say in Luke 4, verses 18 and 19, "The Spirit of the Lord is on me, because he's anointed me to preach good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners, recovery of sight for the blind, to release the oppressed, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." If I was sitting there with you and I asked you, "Who are you?" how would you answer? When I do that with live audiences, they usually give me their name. Okay, you know your name. But is that who you are? What is our identity? It's really despairing today to witness the low level of spirituality that many Christians are operating at today. Many are so wrapped up in their studieship, their discipleship groups, their clubs, their organizations, they don't really know what's going on out there, much less know what's going on in here. There was a Sunday school teacher who was teaching a preschool class about the Old Testament heroes of faith. And they had lessons about Elijah and the chariot of fire and Samson and all the great stories that are there. And she had her children take their crayons out and draw a picture of their favorite Bible story. So one of them drew, like Daniel in the lion's den, and another drew a picture of David killing Goliath, and another had a red Cadillac convertible and an old man with a beard in the front and two people in the back seat. Well, she looked at that one and she thought, I don't know where in the world that one is. And so upon asking the child, where is this one found in the Bible? She said, oh, that's God driving Adam and Eve out of the garden. When you begin discussing God and the divine elements of God and the real understanding of creation, our mental concepts are about that elementary. And we haven't gotten past the flannel graph lesson that has, Eve picking an apple off a tree. And because of that, and a misunderstanding of the very creative concept of what man was created for in the very beginning, we don't know why we were created. So we really have to go back to the beginning and understand that, which, by the way, over the next 6 weeks you're going to be doing as you go through and you start to look at some of the commentaries and some of the things that I've asked you to get and to read. Two undeniable principles that we need to understand are this. Number one, each person on God's great earth is unique. You are unique. You are the one and only. You are special. Why? Because nobody can ever take your place. Nobody can take your place. In Genesis 2 and verse 7, let me add a little translative license here and read what it says from a Hebrew point of view. And Adonai Elohim, that is the totality of all that God is, formed, like a potter, man, Adam, of the dust, the afar, the minute dust-like particles of the ground, and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, or blood. And man became a living soul, or a thing of life. Genesis 2 and verse 7. Now that's a really hard passage to understand intellectually. The word afar means a small, minute particle in Hebrew, something like gold or flour. And what we understand that to mean, of course, is probably this is the ancients' way of talking about cells and the concept of cellular development. Not that it's actual dust, but that the cells which make up the very concept, the DNA, which makes up the very individual, this is where the starting blocks begin. And the Lord God created Adam from the afar of the Adonai, from the small, minute particles of God himself. And in some way, God breathes a part of his countenance, the breath of life, into this material, and this material becomes a living being. Now, what that means is that within every human being, there resides a part of God. Thus, for them to be God is a continuation of what they were created to be. We were created to be an extension of God. And every person was created that way, to be an extension of God. You see, when you understand this concept, you understand that every person, therefore, is unique in that they're displaying an aspect of God, maybe a different aspect of God. We know in the Old Testament there's 72 names of God, and each one of them talk about a different aspect of God. And you're the only person that you're sure you're going to be spending every night with for the rest of your life. So you're going to be sleeping with a friend or an enemy. We must make peace with ourselves and not judge ourselves the way the world does. Look at the way that God created us. This is the way God created us. This is the way we're supposed to look. This is what he wants to give us. A person is the most important thing in the world. And you listening to this, you are part of that magnificent creation. So why are we important? Because God said you are. Because God's Spirit resides within you. Because you were created from the afar, the minute dust-like particles from God himself. That makes us more than a naked ape. We're not some kind of cosmic accident. We're not some, problem that just started and then through a series of beneficial mutations, all of a sudden we have us. We were planned for. We were loved for. We were sacrificed for. That makes each of us the most important thing on the face of the earth. Every one of us. One of the most important attributes that God gave to all of us was the ability to be flexible and to change if need be. It's called a moral choice. When somebody says, I don't like you, you can reply, well, stick around tomorrow, I'll be different. You got a problem with me? Well, I can change. I can always change for better, and I can always change for worse. But if you're going to change for better, you better understand the concept that loving ourselves is the key to loving our neighbor. When you know what you need, then you'll know what your neighbor needs, and you're equipped to help people. If you don't know what you need, you're not going to have a clue as to anybody else because you don't love yourself. You see, this secret of love is the energy of the human being. If God loves, and God's within us, then his power is ours to have. Why love God? Why love our neighbors? Why love ourselves? Because it brings a concentration of power to human beings called love. And since God is described as love, then as we do these things, we portray God. When asked by the teachers of the law which commandments was the most important of them all, Jesus stated in Mark 12, verses 29 through 31, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind, and with all your strength. And the second is this, love your neighbor as yourself. There's no commandment greater than these. You don't love God by looking at sunsets or sitting in quiet meditation humming. That's contemplation, but that's not really loving God. The way you love God is by getting out there where your neighbor is and to love them as you love yourself. A modern day story explains this concept where a man was given permission to visit heaven and hell. So he first goes to hell and sees a great multitude of people seated at long tables with lavish, pallets of food sitting there, yet they're all starving and weeping. The visitor soon saw the reason. Their spoons and forks were longer than their arms, so they can't bring any food to their mouths. Next he goes to heaven, where the same thing, lavish tables of great pallets of food, and the people had spoons and forks longer than their arms and were likewise unable to feed themselves, but they're all joyful and well fed. How so? Because they weren't trying to feed themselves. They were feeding each other. See, the concept of this whole thing is, if I'm going to keep energized and I'm going to have this power of God within me and I'm going to find out what my purpose is, I have to look at myself first and I have to like what I see. And if I don't, then I have the ability to change. But there's no way I can love my neighbor if I don't love myself. And why is it so important, after all, to do this for my neighbor anyway? Well, you know as well as I do that life is draining. You look at the same people day after day, and some of them are hurting, and some of them hurt you. And at times we sit and wonder, life is so draining. Am I actually able to go on with this? And it's at times like that we're ready to throw in the towel. We just need a strong heart. We need to know who we are. We need to know what's the purpose for me being here. And it's unfortunate but true that most crimes are due to a lack of love because they're not thinking of anybody but themselves. And it's not because they love themselves that they're doing what they're doing. It's because usually they hate themselves and they hate everybody around them. And so it doesn't matter if I steal or kill or pillage or rob or rape or whatever. It's all about me. That gives me power. You know that some people have even suggested that this concept of love is almost gone from our modern society? After a rash of shootings, sometimes it's almost weekly now, we say, what's going on? Well, the question comes back around. Do people receive all the love they desire? It's a hard question. Take a small child away from love. What happens to the child? Actually, it was done in the 13th century by Frederick II of Sicily. He was doing the first controlled experiment in psychology. He wanted to identify humankind's natural language. So he had a number of small children that were orphans, were isolated, and were still too young to speak. And since they were all deprived of anybody talking to them or having really anything to do with them, he hoped that sooner or later they'd begin to speak in a primal human language. Now, food was given to them and clothes and other essentials of life, but they weren't allowed to have any physical contact with the children and or hear or say anything to them. All those children died. Why? Like a child in this instance, or a POW, or someone in solitary confinement, away from contact with other people, and the love that exists between you and them, and we become disoriented. Some even lose their minds. You keep your heart alive by knowing how to love and how to receive such yourself. Because I can't love my neighbor if I don't love myself. What would life be if everyone was focused on loving his neighbor with the healthy love that he experienced for himself? I would tell you we'd enter into heaven. That's exactly what heaven is. It's not about me, it's about thee. Life is caring for yourself first and loving yourself, and then your neighbor. You see, we're worth a lot more than we look like we are. It's extremely simple, yet it's very difficult to manage, that life is centered on the basic idea of loving ourselves, and then we'll find the meaning of life and loving them because of our self-examination. And it's in this simple compound idea that we find out who we are, what our purpose is, what we live for, because everything else is simply commentary. And since God created everyone present, that makes you very important in this scheme. You see, you can't complete your destiny until you've learned to love the very person that God created you to be. Some loathe themselves. Some hate themselves from what they did in the past. Some hate themselves for what they're doing right now. Some can't stand the idea of what could happen in the future. Obviously, they don't know who they are. They don't know why they were created by God. They may not like the way they look. They may not like the way that their body is manufactured. But you know, our minds can change. Our minds can develop. Our minds can grow. We can have a better understanding of this. You can love yourself. You must love yourself. Because you can do nothing that God desires of you unless you do. And that's the starting point. So in this concept of the destiny of man, or in the origin of man and everything, let's understand that, first of all, God created man so that, number one, he could love himself. And it's not egotistical. That's just understanding the wholeness and the fullness and the completeness of who you are. But how do we understand that? Well, I hope that in the readings and over the next 5 weeks or 6 weeks that we'll be able to answer that. I appreciate your time. This is the end of the first lecture. May God be with you and inspire you and help you to understand who you are, why you're here, what your purpose is, and what he wants done with you.